Okay, today we're going to have a look how to make a ukulele similar to this one. First step is you need some 40 by 40. This time we've used Pacific maple, but pine also works quite well, and you can rip that down from some framing timber into 40 by 40. There's three measurements which are on the plans. There's two sections which are both 300. There's a 95 and there's a 170. It's a pretty good time at this point maybe to talk about some of the measuring equipment that you might have around the workshop and get the students a little bit more familiar with that. But in this one, the sliding bevel is the tool that we're going to use, and we need to set that at about 9 degrees. If you look in the instructions, an easy way to set it is by using the compass that's in there on the printed page, and you can just use that to set it to 9 degrees. I've already done that, and I've already actually marked out this piece. This usually separates the students a little bit. Some will be a bit slower to mark it out, some will take a bit longer. Of course, we talk about marking our angles, but also marking down the side, because this is going to be cut by hand. Once that's done, usually talk a little bit about different saws, and in this case, use a tenon saw to cut those. Always leaving a little bit of room there for the cut for the students, and quite often this gets tidied up on your drop saw later on, just by setting that to 9 degrees to get a good angle. Once that's done, you'll end up with something like this. And there's our four pieces coming together to form a bit of a trapezoid type shape. There's a couple of options here. I mean, we're trying to make this not so much like a high-end musical instrument, but a project that the kids can achieve. So I often like to just leave it as a fairly heavy construction, and I'll go through how to glue this up in a moment. Or if you're keen to make it a little bit lighter, at this point you can cut part of the inside out, and you'll see what that will do for the project a bit later. But let's just talk about this one for the moment. That's cut, that's ready to go. It actually, if it's a little bit out, by the time the glue gets in there, it ends up being so strong anyway that you probably don't have to worry. But it is good to check all the student work at this stage and make sure that these are fairly square at 90 degrees to the top surface, just to make sure you do get a fairly good bond between the glue. At this point, it's a really good time to talk about jigs and the types of jigs and things that can be used to achieve different things in the workshop. And this is usually when the students might be first introduced to a simple jig for gluing up. And in this case, just using some scrap timber, some leftover boards, I'm not sure where they were from, and a couple of pieces of scrap. We just need to ensure that we've got 300 millimeters between the two boards. It's then quite simple. Lay some baking paper down, just to make sure my glue's not going to stick to this board, and save your baking paper, because that can be used over and over again. Usually the students will be at different points in gluing up. You might make 4 or 5 of these jigs, and maybe, half the class can do it one lesson, half the class can do it in the next. Get the students to make the jigs if you can. It's a pretty simple job, and you can talk about how to put screws in, drills and things like that if you like at that point. Quite simply, one goes in, the second one goes in, and then because these two edges are now parallel to each other. It's really simple, just to get a couple of quick release clamps and to clamp that up with all the glue on there. Just make sure it's nice and flat and leave it to dry until the next lesson, and then that will be ready. Just label there. Okay, the next few steps I'll talk about are ones that involve some teacher preparation. What I've done is just taken some Luan ply, which is fairly reasonably priced and not a bad way to go about it. It is fairly thin. I think it's known by different names, but we've always just called it Luan plywood. You can get different faces on there. Some people like it a bit lighter, like these ones, and others the slightly darker face. Now what you're doing here, you'll take one of your frames which you've glued up. Let's use this one. All I need to do is line that up, mark it, get the students to mark it. There's no reason why they can't mark it. It will be teacher preparation, depending on what year group you're doing it with, if they can't use the bandsaw. But just going along the strips, the glue arm ply like so, and flipping it over, coming back, and marking it up. You might get 8 out of each strip if it's 2400 long, or even more. So now that I've done that, I'll take that over to the bandsaw and quickly rip through that. These, they don't have to be that accurate, so it's something that you can do quite quickly. Once you've done that, you'll have a whole heap of trapezoid shapes. Just like these two. A pair there, and of course each student needs to have 2. The next thing is to make the sound hole. That needs to be done at this point. It can't be done once it's glued together. In this case, it's a 65mm Forstner bit is probably the best, but anything around that size is suitable. A hole saw is probably going to be a little bit more difficult. We found that the Forstner bit is probably the way to go. Quite simply, the students will take this, and to mark it out, they will just find the centre here, which in this case was about 85, and find the centre here, about 130. Mark down a line down the middle, measure down 110mm, and put a cross or a star, or whatever you might want to do there, and then drill with the Forstner bit using the drill press. One little trick with this, always make sure you've got a nice piece of timber or an undamaged piece of timber underneath where the Forstner bit's going to come through, and that'll just stop this side blowing out and having, chips and things on it. Great. So once you've got those 2 all done, you have your trapezoid frame. It's now time to glue them. And a great way to glue them is just to stack and clamp. You can put a little tiny panel pin in each of these corners, because those corners they're going to be lost. We're going to cut those off anyway. So quite often I'll get the students cover that with glue, get a little panel pin each corner just to hold it, piece of baking paper, then on top of this, and then the next student will come over with theirs, a piece of baking paper, and so on, until you end up with a stack of about 4, at which point you can grab a couple of quick release clamps, maybe 6 around the frame, and clamp all those together. So doing it that way cuts down on how many clamps you're using and stops other people from being upset that you're using all the tools in the workshop. It's a good little tip, hopefully. Okay. Once we've got to that stage, you'll get a couple of templates. I'm just going to talk about the body a little bit more, and then I'll talk about the neck separately and the teacher preparation and stuff for that. So the templates that you get, one is for the neck and one is for the body, and they'll come in your kit when you buy a class set of ukulele hardware. Okay, here's that body template. Again, because we've marked and we've found the center here, it makes it really easy, because on the body template, as long as we find the center of it, we can just come along, line that up, and quite simply, I know I haven't drilled the hole in this one yet, the students can just come and trace around it. I guess one key tip here is to leave some space at the top. I probably should have come a little bit higher then, because I want to leave a fair amount of material here, because I'm going to do a sliding dovetail joint to connect the neck and the body together. Once that's done, there's a few different options that you can do here, depending on the class and depending on whether or not you want to do a lot of the prep work or have the students do some. They can actually come along and do a whole lot of your relief cuts. So imagine this is all glued up, it's all ready to go. They can put it into the vise. I'm just going to draw some lines. I'm not going to do the relief cuts, but I think you understand what I mean. Get them to mark out about 1 centimetre increments around, and then using a tenon saw, they can cut down into there. Because you're, again, depending on the year group, a year level, if they can use the bandsaw, you're going to have to come along and rough cut this out for them as well. Okay, once you've done that, the students have cut down here. It's probably the most teacher preparation time, because you're taking this to the bandsaw and you're actually rough cutting the shape of that out. I've got one that I've already done. This has been cut out, and it's also been sanded just on a normal linisher sander to get that curve, and that seems about right for, you know, most types of linishers that you can use in a school these days. It works with the one from Heron Forbes in Australia, and it works with the one from Woodfast. So that angle is pretty easy to get. Depending on the age group and whether or not they can use the linisher, that may be a little bit of teacher preparation. Most of the rest of this shaping can be done on a disc sander, and you can get those together fairly quickly. It's not too time consuming. It might take you an hour to cut them on the bandsaw and shape them up a little bit and ready for the students. And they can hand sand them quite a bit after that. I've actually got ahead one step on this one. I've already started to cut the dovetail, but we will come back to that. Now we're just going to talk about the neck of the ukulele. Again, a little bit of teacher preparation here. I guess you don't make a really good project without having to do some prep work. In this case, we need to get some, I've always just used pine, it's just shaving timber, MGP 10, cheap. Good amount of density is better, so if you get a few pieces and one's really light, It's really good to use the light stuff to make the body. If one's really heavy, it works out well for the neck, but I guess that's just luck of the draw. This will be your second template that you get in the kit. And just before I go to that, I've taken this and run it through the drop saw. Through the table saw. This was 90 by 45, and it must be at least 45. Actually, I think it was 70 by 45, and I just ripped the edge off it so I could get a perfectly flat edge. That's because later on, I'm going to glue my fretboard onto there, and I need those corners to be sharp. The other side, not to worry about it, you can just have the rounded edge on there. Take your template, lay it over, and just a simple matter of tracing that on. To save yourself some time and to give the students a new skill at this point is just to use a smaller Forstner bit. In this case, you can use your xSTEMed calipers if you're in New South Wales. That looks like about a 38. Could be an imperial measurement. It's a bit of an old one. And I'll get the students onto the drill press, and using the Forstner bit, they will drill a hole here, and they'll drill a hole here. Okay, and I've got one that's been done. At least one of the holes has been drilled there, and the other hole's drilled there. Now the reason why they're drilling these holes is to make your life a lot easier on the bandsaw. So all you'll have to do, again, if you're the one that has to do the bandsawing and the students can't, a bandsaw through there, bandsaw up to here, just a nice straight cut. You don't have to do the turn because you've already got that. Come in, bandsaw straight down to here. That will already be gone because you've got your Forstner bit through, and bring it around, bandsaw straight off. You can worry about that bit later. And you'll end up with a neck like that. It does waste a little bit of timber, but there's no way around it, and yeah, if you can give that to someone for firewood, then it's not such a waste, I guess. And there's a finished neck, which has already had the dovetail cut onto it. So yes, using that template, you can get to that point quite easily. Okay, like I said, it is a sliding dovetail joint that we're going to be using to connect the body and the neck. And at this point, I think it's really important, because you've gone to so much trouble with your preparation, to really make sure that your students can mark out and cut a dovetail or sliding dovetail with a fairly good degree of accuracy before letting them loose onto the actual ukulele. I just usually grab whatever's around. This was just a bit of light framing timber that had a whole heap of nail holes in it, but there was still some usable bits of it. So in this case, if you look in the plans, there's some instructions, and I probably don't need to explain how to cut a dovetail, but of course using your marking gauge, you can talk about how to get that accurate, using your marking gauge to mark out, and to cut the tail first, and then, to cut so you can use your marking gauge to mark this out. There's some instructions for cutting dovetails and a sliding dovetail that'll come with your kit, or plenty of YouTube videos if you're not familiar, but I'm sure any of you woodwork teachers out there probably cut a million dovetails, so I won't go too far into that. But doing a practice on this end, maybe doing a practice on this end, and once they can cut a decent sliding dovetail, they can move on. To this part, and again in the instructions that come with your kit, it'll give you the measurements for cutting this. There's many, different angles you could use on your dovetails. You could make it a bit deeper if you wanted to. This seems to work, and the ones that I put in the instructions seem to be pretty accurate. Cutting this first, okay? So we're cutting this out. Once that's cut, the corners are quite sharp. Maybe the teacher cleans them up a little bit with a chisel as they're moving around the room, if needed, or the student cleans it up a little bit with a nice sharp chisel. You can then come along and mark that onto your ukulele body, and in this case I've already done that. This cut's probably one that's a little bit more difficult, but really it is just, as long as that angle's okay, and we mark that and there, and we get that fairly accurate, they seem to come together quite well. That's not quite finished, but again, cleaned up with a chisel until we've got a good fit. Some good quality timber glue once that's done, and you'll have that sitting inside there, like so. Things to think about here is just before, as they're gluing it up, to make sure that the neck and the body are fairly well in line. And usually just a quick release clamp from here to here, so between there and there, is enough to hold that, as well as sometimes a smaller quick release clamp just up the top here to keep it, you know, fairly straight. Okay, now we're going to talk about the fretboard. And here's a fretboard attached to a ukulele. Cutting the fretboard is probably one of the more difficult things that the students might encounter. And in your teacher preparation, I recommend that you probably make a few more of the fretboards than you might need. In the construction guide, you will get some measurements, and it's great just to make a template for marking out those frets. So all I've done, this was actually, I've done this a few times just to save a bit of time depending on how you're going in the project. The students can quite easily go from the guide, measure, and it's good practice for them, and square across all the way down. Or, like I said, just to speed it up, if you make a template, they can simply come along put their marks, grab their square, and I'm not going to go the whole way along here, but mark that up. Merbau, or I think that might have been a little bit of leftover, might have even been some jarrah or something, but I found Merbau's the cheap and easy version. You don't need a heap of it. Even a Merbau post that you can rip down, because you do need to get that width. You do need to get the 45mm width across there to ensure that you've got enough room for your strings. Okay. I might recommend that you have a pretty good quality bench hook, maybe a freshly made one, wouldn't hurt for this. This one's a little bit old. It can easily be done with one of these gent saws, which are available from Tools for Schools in Australia. It does need to be kept in fairly good condition, and we don't want it to be bent or anything like that. There are specialist saws that can be used to cut it, but importantly, it just needs to have a very thin blade. And these are about $30, so they're not too much of an investment, and they are fantastic for joint work by hand. And just lining up the frets using the bench hook to keep my 90 degrees. And there we go. We do need that to be quite an accurate cut, and we do need the width of the cut to only be the width of the saw. So where the students can go wrong here is if they're tilting the saw over, they'll end up with a cut that's too wide, and the fret wire, which we'll talk about in a minute, won't seat into there. Okay, I've just gone and cut a couple of the slots there for the fret wire. And what you'll get is a roll of fret wire, okay? And you'll get more than enough for your class kit, but you still do need to be frugal with it, because once it's all gone, I mean, you will have to order more, but there will definitely be some left over. I usually just use a pair of tin snips, but side cutters would work just as well. To cut off a length, maybe about 30 centimeters, and give that to the students, and they just need to spend some time, just by hand, straightening that fret wire out. And the better job that they can do of straightening this now, the better that fret wire will go into those slots. Once it's straightened, I usually just get them to get their fretboard, line it up, come back a few millimeters with their finger, and then come along, chop that one, same again, line it up. A little bit longer, of course, is better than a little bit shorter. There's many ways you can do this, it's just a suggestion. Until I've got all of those cut. I can, if I need to, I can use a small one to do any final straightening. You'll see from the fret wire why it's so important that these cuts are accurate, because the fret wire isn't glued in place. It's held in there by some little tabs on the side of the fret wire. So the students just place that in. Like I said, a little bit of overhang is not a big deal at this point. And without bashing, just use a steel hammer to seat that in. Just tapping those in. Sometimes you'll find if the cuts just aren't accurate enough and it is coming back out, a little bit of super glue will certainly hold it in as well. And you'd go through and you'd put those all the way along, like this example. Once you've got to that point, it probably is the best time to now glue up the neck and the body. The simple reason for that is you can use your fretboard to maintain a nice flat connection there by clamping once here and once there. So as in this example, we clamp our fretboard, we've glued it all up, we clamp our fretboard to the body through like that, we clamp our fretboard again to the neck, and then, if needed, a final clamp from the neck down to the base of the body can help to add even more strength. Plenty of glue in the joint, and that should be strong enough. Okay, it's at this point that you might get the students to start to add a little bit of detail. The pickguard is something that they can design, and usually you can just get a piece of your Merbau. That was a Merbau post. Drill through with your 65mm Forstner bit, and then allow them to sketch out and plan for their pickguard. They can then shape it using a coping saw and disc sander and come up with an interesting design. If you've got time and you want to take it a little bit further, sometimes they can get out, the the Posca pens and things like that, and start to put a little bit of artwork on there. Or if they do a lot of planning, even the wood burner can come into play there at this point. I mean, you can take it as far as you like, and if you do have a really good student that might be a bit more capable, they can, you know, even go as far as this design where they've sort of come up with everything themselves. Okay, the next step is to mark out for our tuning pegs. Okay, and you're going to get enough tuning pegs in the kit for your class sets. And the spacing is fairly important, and also the position in relation to the top of the neck. I'll include this template just to make life a little bit easier for everybody, which corresponds with this design to make that a nice and simple process. So let's see that on this example that has not had the holes drilled yet. I line up the template with the very top of my neck, take a sharp pencil, and I can mark those out. That actually requires a 6mm hole, but I found a 6.5mm drill bit to give a little bit of room in there, because often the students aren't that accurate. Also, starting with a very small, maybe 2mm drill bit initially will help get those holes a little bit straighter and more accurate, and then following through with the 6.5, or even doing 3 steps. So going with a 2mm to a 4mm to a 6mm to try and make sure that they get those holes nice and accurate and don't make a mess of it. If they are a bit messy, there are these cups which are included in the kit which do help to cover that up a little bit. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the hardware for your ukulele. So you get a bridge, a nut, your tuning pegs, your strings, and your fret wire as part of the kit. The kits also come with a little part on the bridge here which can be used to help to position the height or distance between the frets and the strings, and that's quite important and something that you can probably play around with. Okay, and finally you might find that you need to make a small spacer between the nut and the neck just to get that string to fretboard distance accurate, and that's something that you probably will just need to play around with depending on how wide your fretboards have been and so forth. There are some cutting lists that come in the instructions to help guide you with that, but I do find that this part with the bridge spacer and the part with the nut spacer are individual to the ukuleles depending on, you know, how accurate the student has been. Please don't hesitate to contact xSTEMed if you want any more information. I know some of you woodwork teachers out there will probably take some of this stuff to a whole new level, but I do hope that helps and gets you underway with the project. Thank you.